Welcome to the final video of Part 7 on sustainable insurance. My name is Gregor Weiss, and I hold the chair in sustainable banking here at Leipzig University. We've covered how insurance works, the physical and transition risks of climate change, the protection gap, and the regulatory framework. Now in Part F, let's get concrete. What sustainable products do insurers actually sell? What does the academic evidence say? And which companies are leading the way? This is the video where all the theory of the previous 6 pays off in concrete practice. Real products, real companies, real research. Then we'll draw the whole chapter together with the key takeaways, so you leave Part 7 with a clear mental map of the entire topic. Let's start with the products, because sustainable insurance isn't only about risk and regulation. It's also a growing market of genuinely useful offerings. Here are 6. First, usage-based cover. Telematics motor insurance that tracks how much and how you drive and rewards lower mileage and lower emissions. Second, build back greener. After a claim, the policy pays to rebuild to a higher energy efficiency standard rather than simply restoring what was there. Third, renewables and electric vehicle cover. Specialist insurance for solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and electric cars. The hardware of the transition. Fourth, parametric products. The fast index-based payouts for climate shocks that we explored earlier. Fifth, nature-based insurance, ensuring natural defenses like coral reefs and mangroves, which protect coastlines from storms, a fascinating frontier. And sixth, microinsurance, affordable cover for low-income households, which we'll return to in a moment. Notice the pattern. Insurers can support sustainability, both by managing climate risk and by actively enabling green activity. Let me draw out the nature-based example because it's my favorite illustration of how creative this field is getting. In 2019, a stretch of coral reef off Mexico's Yucatan coast became, reportedly, the first natural asset in the world to be insured with a parametric policy. Why insure a reef? Because a healthy reef acts as a natural breakwater. It absorbs wave energy and protects the hotels and beaches behind it from storm damage. When a hurricane hits, the parametric policy pays out fast, and the money funds a trained reef brigade to repair the coral before it dies. So the insurance keeps a piece of natural infrastructure alive, which in turn protects the insured economy behind it. It's a beautiful example of aligning financial incentives with ecological ones, protecting nature because nature protects us. Now the evidence. A foundational paper here is due to Bert Scholtens from the University of St Andrews in Scotland from 2009, one of the earliest systematic assessments of corporate social responsibility among international insurers. Scholtens built a framework to compare insurers across several dimensions: their policies, their management systems, their products, and their stakeholder engagement. And the central finding was wide variation. CSR performance differed enormously from firm to firm and from country to country. Some insurers were already treating sustainability as core to their business. Others had barely started. The lasting contribution of the paper was to put sustainability on the agenda as something central to the insurance business, not a peripheral add-on. And it set the direction for much of the research that followed. It's worth pausing on the date, 2009. That's well before the Paris Agreement, before most of the regulation we discussed today, before climate risk was front-page news in finance. So this was genuinely ahead of its time, and it's instructive to compare where we were then with where we are now. What Scholtens had to argue for, that sustainability belongs at the core of insurance, is today simply assumed, written into European law, and measured by every major ESG rating agency. In just 15 years, sustainable insurance has moved from a niche academic argument to a mainstream regulated reality. That trajectory is, in a sense, the story of this whole course in miniature. Let's look at a leading company. This slide shows the sustainability performance of Allianz, one of the world's largest insurers, as tracked by ESG raters. Here, the S&P Global Corporate Sustainability Assessment, which grew out of the well-known Robeco-SAM assessment. The broader point, connecting back to Part 4 on measurement and Part 5 on ratings, is that large insurers are now systematically scored on their sustainability, and those scores are public. That external scrutiny creates real pressure to improve, and it lets investors, regulators, and customers compare insurers on more than just price and financial strength. But keep in mind the caveat we met back in Part 5. ESG ratings from different providers often disagree, sometimes sharply, because they measure different things and weight them differently. So a single high score doesn't tell the whole story. You have to ask what is actually being measured. For an insurer, the most meaningful questions are concrete ones. Is it still underwriting new coal? What is the carbon intensity of its investment portfolio? Is it raising or withdrawing cover in climate-exposed regions? A sustainability rating is a useful summary, but the substance lies in these underlying business decisions, which is exactly why the disclosure rules we discussed matter so much. Let's widen out to a few illustrative cases of insurers in transition. First, the great reinsurers, Munich Re and Swiss Re. Beyond taking on catastrophe risk, they are the world's leading houses for natural catastrophe data and climate science. As we noted, their whole business depends on modeling the future climate accurately. Second, AXA and Allianz, early movers on exiting coal, on materiality analysis, and on integrating ESG across their operations. And third, a German example, Gothaer, a mutual insurer that has built a dedicated sustainability rating and strategy. Together, these show that sustainable insurance isn't one single model. It looks different for a global reinsurer, a large multinational primary insurer, and a domestic mutual. That last point is worth drawing out. Gothaer is a mutual. It's owned by its policyholders, not by outside shareholders. That ownership structure can actually make sustainability easier to pursue, because a mutual isn't under the same quarterly pressure to maximize shareholder returns. It can take a longer view, which aligns naturally with long-horizon climate risk. It's a nice reminder that how a company is owned shapes how it approaches sustainability, something we saw with cooperative banks back in Part 6. And the reinsurers deserve a final word, because Munich Re and Swiss Re sit at the very top of the risk chain and hold the best climate data in the world, where they lead on pricing climate risk. The rest of the industry tends to follow. They are, in effect, the climate conscience of the whole sector. Now let's give the social dimension its due, because insurance isn't only about the E in ESG. Microinsurance provides affordable cover to low-income households against exactly the shocks that can push a family into poverty. Bad weather, illness, crop failure. It directly addresses the protection gap in emerging markets, which is squarely the social, the S dimension of sustainability. Microinsurance is often parametric, so payouts are fast and cheap to administer, and it's frequently delivered by mobile phone and supported by development finance. The bigger idea here is powerful. Insurance can be a tool for resilience and development, not merely risk transfer. For a family living close to the edge, a small, fast payout after a drought can be the difference between staying afloat and falling into destitution. There's even evidence that simply having insurance changes behavior before any disaster strikes. A farmer who knows a bad harvest won't wipe them out is willing to invest in better seeds and fertilizer rather than hoarding cash against catastrophe. So the cover doesn't just cushion losses, it unlocks productive risk-taking and can raise incomes in normal years too. That said, microinsurance is hard to make work. Premiums must be tiny, trust is often low, and distribution to remote households is expensive, which is exactly why parametric triggers and mobile phones have been such important enablers. We'll pick this theme up again in Part 12 on microfinance and microinsurance. Let's bring the whole chapter together with 5 key takeaways. 1. Insurers both carry risk and invest the float, so sustainability matters on both balance sheets, as underwriter and as investor. 2. Climate change is widening the protection gap and making some risks effectively uninsurable, as we saw dramatically in California, Florida, and the German flood zones. 3. Insurers share catastrophe risk through reinsurance, catastrophe bonds, and parametric and sovereign risk pools, an increasingly sophisticated chain reaching into the global capital markets. 4. Regulation is hardening. Solvency. 2 now embeds ESG. Supervisors IOPA and the IAIS are active. The reporting rules CSRD, SFDR, and the taxonomy apply, and the United Nations Principles for Sustainable Insurance guide the industry. And 5. Voluntary climate alliances like the Net Zero Insurance Alliance proved fragile. And rigorous evidence shows that climate change is already reshaping insurance and mortgage markets today, not in some distant future. If you remember nothing else, remember this. Insurers see climate change first because they price it, which makes them one of our most important early warning systems. This slide and the 2 that follow collect the sources for Part 7, and I genuinely encourage you to explore them. This first slide lists the academic literature, Schoenmaker and Schramada's textbook, which anchors much of this chapter. Scholtens on corporate social responsibility in insurance, the trio of papers by Sastry, Sen, Tenekejeva, and co-authors on insurer exit, pricing, and the protection gap, and the real estate studies by Bernstein, Baldauf, Giglio, and their colleagues on whether house prices reflect climate risk. These are your starting points if you want to go deeper. And several would make excellent seminar or thesis topics. The second reference slide gathers the regulation and frameworks, the Solvency II Directive and its 2024 review, the guidance and stress tests from IOPA, the supervisory paper from the IAIS, the United Nations Principles for Sustainable Insurance and the history of the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, and the European Union rules, CSRD, SFDR, and the taxonomy, which we also covered back in Part 5. If you're writing about the regulatory side of sustainable insurance, start here. And the third slide lists the data sources and cases. The Swiss Re Institute Sigma report on natural catastrophes, the Insure Our Future scorecard on fossil fuel underwriting, the Artemis report on the catastrophe bond market, and the sovereign risk pools like CCRIF, the German Insurance Association, the GDV, CCRIF, the German Insurance Association, the GDV, on the Elementarschaden debate, and company disclosures from AXA, Allianz, Swiss Re, Munich Re, and Gothaer. That brings us to the end of Part 7. Thank you for watching this series on sustainable insurance. I hope you now see why insurers sit right at the front line of climate change and why sustainability runs through the very core of their business. In the next part of the course, we move on to sustainable investments. See you there.